Welcome to the 17th Annual ChinaFest, an event shared by the University of Richmond and the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and made possible by Rose Chen and the Rose Group. I'm Martha Merritt, Dean of International Education at the University of Richmond, and it's my pleasure to introduce Rose Chen. I'm sorry to have to do so remotely, but the pandemic doesn't spare even well-intentioned deans. Please know how much I wish I could be with you live for today's exciting lecture and panel discussion. Rose Chen is a longtime friend of the University of Richmond, starting with her partnership and friendship with Irby B. Brown, himself a UR alumnus who became our beloved professor of film and television, and like Rose, was an entrepreneur long before such things became widely practiced. Irby's passing in 2016 led to important initiatives in his honor, as Rose will share, and there's real symmetry in the current holder of the Irby B. Brown Scholarship, Yishuan Zhou, having become president of UR's Chinese Student and Scholar Association. But my focus is on Rose and her magic facilitation of connections and serendipity for so many. She has continued the tradition of partnering with UR for a lecture and film series to help to advance understanding of China beyond the headlines, beautifully represented by today's speaker, Susan Thornton. And Rose has helped us to extend the reach of ChinaFest to include Chinese students sharing their hometowns with our campus, sport, and other ways to convey the rich complexity of life in China today. Thank you, dear Rose. We appreciate your partnership and friendship deeply and look forward to another sparkling ChinaFest this year.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our opening. Martha, thank you very much for your kind words. It has always been a pleasure to have our events here at University of Richmond. Under your leadership, faculty members and student participation have increased greatly. Thank you. Regrettably, we cannot meet in person. All our programs are in virtual. Please check UR website for the digital contents of our this year's event, including 3 excellent films about China, and our other wonderful partner, the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. The link for the Family Day will be activated on February the 5th at 10 a.m. We have excellent programs and activities for the whole family. Hope you enjoy it. Now I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our sponsor, partners, supporters, committee members, and many volunteers that make ChinaFest possible and enjoyable. Last but not least, you, our audience, from family with young kids, students, lifelong learner like members at the Osher Institute. You are the reason we are doing it. And your participation and encouragement keep us going. Thank you. Our opening lecture has been renamed in memory of our beloved advisory chair, Dr. Irby B. Brown, who was instrumental in opening doors for me at University of Richmond. Now I'm delighted to introduce you to our this year's keynote speaker, Susan Thornton. Susan is a retired senior diplomat. She got her MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins Tsai and BA from Bowdoin College in Economics and Russian. Over the span of 30 years in foreign service, she had involved in policy planning and held leadership positions across China, Korea, former Soviet Union. She retired as the acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. Susan is currently a senior fellow and visiting lecturer at Yale University, director of the Forum on Asia Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and a non-resident fellow at Brookings. With Susan's unique perspectives and years of frontline experience, she will enlighten us about the problems as well as the prospects of the critical Sino-American relations. There will be panel discussion and Q&A follow her talk. Over to you, Susan. The platform is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Rose, and to everybody who's tuning in today. Thank you so much for being with us for this very important conversation about the topic of US-China relations, which is going to be affecting all of us and our children and our futures. And so it's, I think, very worthwhile that we take a moment to focus in on what is going on in US-China relations and where we think things are headed. But I'd first like to wish a very happy Lunar New Year, Chinese New Year to all those friends and colleagues around the world who celebrate this very important holiday, certainly in China. And I'm so happy to see that the University of Richmond is getting in on the festivities and looking to celebrate what is a very important holiday, certainly in Asia and increasingly, I think, around the world. And we have the Year of the Tiger this year, so we hope that that portends some auspicious events coming our way. I guess, US policy toward China, I think we all know, has changed in the past several years and changed dramatically. The change was heralded in 2018 when President Donald Trump's national security strategy declared that strategic competition should animate the United States approach to Beijing going forward. But there was no clear answer to the question of what the competition is over and what it means to win. What exactly is the US competing for? What might be a plausible desired outcome of this competition? And I think it's clear that a failure to connect competitive means to clear ends will allow US policy to drift toward competition for competition's sake and then fall into a dangerous cycle of confrontation. The words I've just spoken are not actually my words. These are words that were written by the current National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and the current White House Czar for Asia Policy, Kurt Campbell, in mid-2019. In January 2020, these two authors of this article called Competition Without Catastrophe in Foreign Affairs, these two authors became the main architects of the US approach to China for the Biden administration, which of course has just passed its first year in office. So I think it seems reasonable today that we look at and try to ask how these architects of the approach to China under Biden have answered the questions they asked in 2019 when they were not in office. And what I'd like to do today is to start by looking at current policy toward China as articulated by Biden administration officials. I'd like to look back a bit at the policy of engagement toward China, which preceded the current moment. I'd like to try to decipher with you what factors led to the dramatic change, and then finally to discuss how we might move forward from here or what we can expect from US-China relations in the coming years and decades. So let's start where we are right now today. You can't listen to somebody in the current US government talk about China without them telling you that the US-China relationship is currently animated by competition. The modifier for competition is different depending on who's talking. Sometimes strategic competition, sometimes stiff competition, sometimes across the board competition, whole of society competition. But what they have said is that the competition between the US and China is playing out not just in the Asia Pacific, but around the globe, as China openly pursues an international order at odds with American security, prosperity, values, and interests. So this is the framing for how the US government currently sees the US-China relationship. And they say they've taken a global approach to advance our own, a US vision for the global order, as opposed to a Chinese vision for the global order. And at the same time, you know, what this entails is kind of US self-strengthening, getting our own house in order. We've heard that phrase quite a bit. Getting our allies to align with us in our policy to compete with China, strengthening our relationships with allies and partners, and retaking the US position on the global stage. And at the same time, we're keeping lines of communication open to the Chinese leadership to try to manage the competition and make sure that it doesn't veer into conflict. And this is the rationale that was given for the phone call between, or the video conference that we saw at the end of last year between President Biden and President Xi Jinping of China. And the bumper sticker for this policy is that, you know, we want to effectively compete with the PRC to ensure that the US and its allies and partners are writing the rules of the 21st century. And this has been a pretty consistent framing for the US approach to China under the Biden administration for the past year. Not much has changed or moved. They say they have the 5 pillars of this approach to China policy in the Biden administration. The first pillar is investing in ourselves. We can't just play defense, we should play offense. You know, and this gets at all of the legislation in Congress that Biden is promoting to try to pass programs and funding to reinvest in American both infrastructure, innovation capacity, science and technology, and also human capital. So investing in ourselves is the first pillar. Second pillar, aligning with our allies and partners, as I mentioned, to try to get them to lend their weight, their capital to our policy of competing with China in order to advance a kind of an affirmative vision for the global system, which is consistent with the values and interests of these democratic allies and partners, particularly Europe and Japan. But also looking to try to set up coalitions of countries that are like-minded with the United States that can pool their resources to compete with China, or to sort of continue the sort of contain China or ring China, push back on security issues with China. The third pillar is shaping the international environment around China, which gets to the issue of kind of rejuvenating US leadership on the global stage. So we had pulled out of a number of international agreements, treaties, organizations under the Trump administration, and the Biden administration has been very clear that they think this US re-entry into a lot of these areas is very important for US leadership. So, you know, signed the Paris climate, or rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, you know, rejoined the World Health Organization, which the previous administration had abandoned, you know, trying to restart the Iran nuclear deal that was abandoned by the previous administration, et cetera. But also in this pillar is the notion of democracies competing with and opposing or confronting or challenging autocracies. There's a fear that autocracies have spread, led by China, in other parts of the world, and that democracies need to band together and challenge autocracies and show that they can still serve the people through a democratic system, and that system works better than the system of autocracy. So this is why we saw, I think, President Biden convene this democracy summit virtually at the end of last year, which created some consternation among various countries around the world, but which was meant to try to promote democracy as a system that can deliver. The fourth pillar they've talked a lot about is human rights and standing up for human rights, holding countries accountable, especially China, for human rights violations, imposing costs on China for violations. And this, gets to the issues that are brought about by the modernization of technology and the fears that the power of these kind of new technological tools can be used and abused by autocratic governments like China, particularly when China has companies that can install technology hardware in foreign countries and then enable foreign autocratic governments to reap sort of totalitarian control over their civilians and their citizens. So I think this idea of human rights and technology surveillance in the 21st century are closely identified in this pillar. And this is one of the areas that's been prominently featured in the Biden administration, but which is also maybe among the most confusing. And in here, relevant to upcoming in the next couple of weeks is, of course, this diplomatic boycott that the US has announced of the Beijing Winter Olympics, which are due to start in the coming weeks, which we can talk about in the question session if people would like. And then the fifth pillar of the policy toward China under the Biden administration is what they call responsible management of competition, sort of putting up what they call guardrails to make sure that the competition doesn't veer into confrontation. And the way they've done this so far, we haven't gotten too far on this pillar, to be honest, but is to keep the leader level contacts going. So President Biden, President Xi have talked on the phone twice and had a video conference in the last year. And that's very important for managing US-China relations, both in the Biden administration, but also historically, it's been very important to have leader level conversations. And also there's been some discussion under this pillar of transnational issues, such as the pandemic, such as climate change, or other areas where the US and China might cooperate. But the administration has been very quick after noting that they're looking for these areas of cooperation. They've been very quick to say that this is not something that the US is willing to kind of take up in a negotiation where, for example, the US would have to trade something in order to get Chinese cooperation on these transnational issues. They say that China's contributions on transnational issues are in its own interest, and it should choose and be willing to cooperate with the United States on these issues, not for the sake of the US-China bilateral relationship, but more because it's responsibility as a major global player. So it's not really clear from that what specifically they mean by cooperation, but it seems clear that cooperation is a sensitive subject for the Biden administration, and they always caveat it with this notion that they're not giving anything away for the cooperation. So in short, when you hear administration officials talk now about the US approach to China, in behind closed doors, the catchphrase is kind of about China without China. Our China policy is about China. We're doing a lot of things having to do with the fact that China is a competitor, but we're not doing the things with China. So the pillars include things like US self-strengthening, working with allies, working with international organizations, censoring China for human rights violations, and then at the very last pillar, sort of talking to them in very narrow channels, infrequently, and then, you know, maybe looking for areas of cooperation, but not offering anything for that cooperation. So we're not really engaging at all in the kind of communication directly with China that we have had for the last 40 years. And I think this is very different from where we've been prior to 2017. So the turnaround in approach has really happened only within the last 5 years. And I think that's probably clear to those of you who have been following the US-China relationship, but I just wanted to foot stomp the point that this is a very kind of recent development, and it's kind of a 180-degree change. In the Obama administration, where I worked also on China policy, you know, we had over 100 dialogue mechanisms between the United States and China on almost every issue that you could possibly name, because China was such a big player and becoming such a big player on the global stage, that almost every issue that the US would work on in the international system, China would be a significant, have a significant effect on that issue. And so it was important that we open communication with China to get their views, to find out what they were thinking, where they were going, and see if we could affect their decision-making or views on at least the information environment, et cetera. These conversations in the Obama administration, which were held under the auspices of this strategic framework, you know, we saw progress on issues from non-proliferation to environmental protection to peacekeeping operations in Africa, for example, economic reform issues, et cetera. And we had separate kinds of communication mechanisms for all of these various issues and many, many more. And the consensus now, however, is that these discussions were not worthwhile, didn't produce enough, weren't worth the candle, and didn't do enough to alter either the Chinese system or change Chinese behavior. And the conclusion that has been reached is that really talking to China and, you know, having a sit down or a negotiation or a discussion is no longer really a credible method for pursuing US goals and interests with China. So, you know, that is a very marked change from President Obama, whose mantra on China was that he's more worried about China's failure as far as US interests are concerned. He would be more worried about a failure in China than he would be about China's success. He felt that the US was strong and resilient enough to deal with a successful China, but that it might not a failed China might not be very easy for the US or anyone else to deal with. So that view has, even though President Biden was the vice president during that administration, obviously, that view has changed. And, you know, President Biden inherited a lot of this from the Trump administration and has had to, you know, adjust. And certainly, you know, the political environment on China has changed dramatically in the US. And so I think it's worth thinking through, you know, what happened there? Why did that happen? Because, you know, this is looking back, I think historians will look at this period and say, wow, that was a huge change in US foreign policy. Richard Haass, who's the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, said that the change in US approach to China is the fastest 180-degree change that he's ever seen on any major US foreign policy issue in history. So, you know, that because China is so important and so huge and has such an outsized impact on everything that happens in the world, you know, it's very important that we understand what happened, what we're trying to do, make sure that the American people are aware of all of this, and, you know, try to think through what are the implications going to be, and how we're going to manage it. So let's look first at a couple of explanations that people have given for this, you know, sea change in US approach to China. The first explanation I'm sure everybody is well aware of, which is that China has, you know, changed. It has been growing. You know, when we were working with China in the past, it was not as powerful, but over the last 2 decades, it's really grown by leaps and bounds economically. It has increased its military might. It has really been feeling its oats, looking to move out on the world stage and get its due regard in keeping with its newfound power. And it has also, under President Xi Jinping, taken on a more kind of aggressive character, both with respect to its neighbors and, you know, lashing out using military aggression or military means or coercive measures against other countries, but also repression at home. And I'm sure everybody has heard and read about the Xinjiang camps for re-education, where people have been detained in mass numbers. And the US government has labeled this whole effort that's been going on for a number of years as a genocide with respect to the Uyghur people in China. So, and there are other things that have happened, of course, the national security law that was passed and the crackdown in Hong Kong following the demonstrations and protests there, and the detention of many dissidents, et cetera. So this is kind of one explanation, that China had fundamentally changed under Xi Jinping. Things were starting to get more difficult in the Obama administration. The Obama officials were frustrated. But then when Trump came in, he really lowered the boom and said, enough is enough. And we got to, you know, get tough and push back on this behavior. The second explanation for what has happened is a theory that's been put forward a number of years ago now by several international relations scholars, having to do with the shifting balance of power in the international system, and most famously outlined by Graham Allison, who's at the Harvard Kennedy School, in a book called The Thucydides Trap, Destined for War, which is a pretty ominous title. But what he outlines in his book is this phenomenon in history where when you have a nation state rising power that's coming up and growing in importance and clout and influence and vibrancy, and is challenging a status quo hegemonic power, or any status quo power, but in this case, the US hegemonic power, that will create a fear, suspicion, and backlash on the part of the status quo power, and lead, in the case of his book, most often lead to actual military conflict. There are some cases where it did not lead to military conflict. Probably most obviously the transition from Britain as a leader of the sort of global system to the United States in the wake of the First World War and leading up through the end of the Second World War and decolonization, et cetera. But that has been a theory that has been mooted as an explanation for what we're seeing from a more kind of objective or sort of dispassionate look at the power balances in the international system between nation states. And there's a lot more that has been written and said on this, including by offensive realist authors like John Mearsheimer. But in general, the idea is that nations in the international system are anarchic, there's no hierarchy, and they will jostle for power and a position as the top dog in the international system. I think, certainly these two explanations do have a lot of relevance when we're looking at the US-China situation today. Chinese policies have changed over time. They've definitely pursued a rapid military modernization that threatens and scares a lot of China's neighbors. We've seen repression at home in China, certainly the issues that I mentioned, and more that people are all aware of in the West. And we've seen, in my view, maybe almost most importantly, we've seen a turn away from China's determination to pursue, a market-based economy, integration into the globalized system, opening and reform internally in China, and a reversion to kind of a more party-centric, party control, state intervention in their economy. And those are all things that cause major concern on the part of the rest of the world, but particularly the developed world and democratic world. And then there's also the case, of course, that the Thucydides dynamic is certainly at work here, with the power shift affecting how these two countries regard each other and how they feel threatened by one another. But I think neither of these explanations is wholly satisfactory. And I think the answer is typically complicated. And we definitely have to also look at the changing role of the United States in the international system. US-China engagement started as a very pragmatic arrangement to counter the Soviet Union. With the Soviet collapse in 1991, the arrangement between the US and China obviously changed. This was also right after Tiananmen Square, which contributed to this dynamic. But the arrangement that was worked out for the 90s and 2000s was one of kind of an unequal partnership in the pursuit of globalization and prosperity. So it seemed okay, China was weak, it was still developing, it wasn't much of a military power. And the US was the unipolar superpower in the world during this period. So, it was an arrangement, although people look back on it now and some people are saying, well, the US shouldn't have, been so blithe in helping China's development because it was creating the power that would subsequently come to challenge it. It didn't appear so at the time. And there was really a pretty widespread consensus about this being the way that the US should go. And a lot of optimism about the trajectory of China's development, which lasted, I would say, pretty much until the 2008-2009 financial crisis in the US, which is when I would say this unipolar superpower era began to kind of unravel a little bit. And then that combined with misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan really started to make the US feel a little bit less secure about its position in the world and its position internally. And I think, there are a lot of factors that we could tease out here, but all of these things together, you can kind of see sort of things building toward a situation that was unstable and probably going to see some kind of a change. And that's what we're kind of grappling with now. I do think that the difficulty of US politics in grappling with these changes is also a major driver of the current trend, but certainly there's politics in China as well, and there are global politics that are relevant to all of this. Just in closing then, because Rose really wanted me to talk about how the US and China could move forward to cooperation, how we can get out of our current stalemate. I call the current period in US-China relations petulant drift, because it seems that the US and China are not really interacting and the relationship is just being allowed to kind of drift along with intermittent kind of barbs thrown across the Pacific at one another. And I do worry that it seems like it's going to last for quite some time. There doesn't seem to be a lot of movement toward what I was used to when I worked in diplomacy, which was just trying to find pragmatic solutions to problems. We don't see that kind of communication happening right now between the US and China. China, of course, has said that it does not agree with this characterization that the US administration has put forward of the relationship as being primarily competitive. They believe very strongly that competition needs to be balanced by cooperation and by work on areas where the US and China have common interests, and they believe that the US and China still have very much balanced sphere of common interests, and do not see that the competition should be overwhelming that cooperative area. They name items like transnational issues, climate change, the pandemic, surveillance for future pandemics, but also working to solve regional hotspots, like China is, of course, working with us on the Iran nuclear negotiations. They're also very worried about North Korea. They're worried about Myanmar. They're worried about problems in Africa. And they think that the US and China should be working together to try to figure out how to ameliorate those conflicts. China is very interested in promoting stability and global order and strengthening the international system. To do so, they want to pursue more resources in global development, in meeting the UN's sustainable development goals, helping the developing world to develop their economies and prosper, et cetera. And they believe that the US and China should be working together on all those areas. But the US currently sees the Chinese state as a pretty inimical threat to US national security across the board. And while we have that perception of the Chinese state, it is very hard to see how the two can have a productive relationship in this kind of atmosphere. And the Chinese have also indicated that unless we can find a way to frame the relationship in a more healthy or balanced way than just talking about competition, it'll be very hard for them to put forward some productive lines of effort for cooperation, because it will be seen as kind of in the sort of public opinion as kind of rewarding the US for bad behavior, I guess would be how they would put it. Meanwhile, the US government sees climate change technology as a strategic sector for our national security purposes and is unlikely to find cooperation with China to be attractive on something like that, even though I think many people would say, well, climate change is kind of like finding a cure for cancer. Do we really care who gets the money from finding the cure for cancer? We'd rather just have a cure for cancer, and that would be a global good for humanity. But that is not kind of the prevailing sentiment now in this bigger dynamic where both sides kind of feel threatened, feel that the other side is trying to undermine or sabotage their economy even. And so I think, just today I heard an administration official talking with US businesses and saying that the administration is warning and discouraging businesses, US businesses, from doing business with China because it threatens our national security, our values, and our interests. So this is going to be a very tough time for US business, who's been doing incredibly well in the China market, and many of whom see the China market as an important part of their global brand and their global planning in the future, it's going to be very hard for them to navigate a lot of these differences. How in this environment do we maintain optimism? I would say we're still at an early stage in this transition, this 180-degree change, and many things are still muddled and unclear. Certainly, Chinese behavior on many issues is causing concern, and US and other countries are responding to that. But we can hope, I guess, that the Chinese government will take this in and maybe recalibrate some of its behavioral areas that we have concerns about and try to adjust. I don't think this would solve the larger problem of the power transition dynamic that Graham Allison talks about, but it would definitely make the atmosphere more conducive to some kinds of cooperation that could then come in and start to balance the competitive aspects, and would put us back on a closer to a path that would be sustainable and more productive. The other possibility, I suppose, the not optimistic possibility, is that things will continue to kind of deteriorate to the point where there's some kind of catharsis or crisis, and that might also produce, a reckoning and a kind of a more, kind of bring us up short and think about what's important. I hope that we don't have to have that in order to reach a point of kind of reckoning and reasonableness on US-China relations. But I think that is a second possibility. So with that, why don't I stop there, Rose, and we can have some questions and discussion, which I very much look forward to. Thank you.
Dr. Chen, would you like to introduce yourself, and then I'll say who I am, and then we'll start questions?
Sure. I'm Dan Chen, Assistant Professor of Political Science. Thank you so much, Susan, for this thoughtful talk. I really enjoyed it. So my question is about people-to-people diplomacy. So recently, some China scholars argue that we should refocus our attention on people-to-people diplomacy. So things like collaboration among civil society groups, business relationships, people exchange, including study abroad programs and student exchanges between US and China, and also cultural exchange. So for example, I know a comedian, Jesse Appel. He's American, but he does Mandarin stand-up comedy and has a large following in China. And his topics are mainly about cultural similarities and the differences between US and China. So mainly to humanize people in both countries. So I'm curious about your thoughts on the potential of people-to-people diplomacy in maintaining engagement between these two countries while the government relationships remain fraught, and there doesn't seem to be much willingness on the leadership to break the tension. I wonder how much potential you think there is for people-to-people diplomacy to make the US-China relationship better.
No, that is a fantastic question, and it's ChinaFest, so we should certainly be talking about people-to-people exchange and culture, and I am a huge advocate of the power of people-to-people diplomacy. You mentioned and I talked about how the official relationship is very fraught and pretty much stuck. And the other thing that's happened in the context of that is that the public narratives about, in each country about the other have taken to this, and COVID-19, we should say, has a lot to do with where we are now too. And it's very hard to separate out all these factors, but the public narratives have taken to kind of projecting a kind of a dehumanizing picture of the other, and this very kind of othering narratives that we have now, and I've noticed, have gotten sort of sharper and sharper here about China, and in China about the US, and you hear sort of more and more kind of cartoonish narratives about the other, and this kind of people-to-people exchange can really put a human face and a human context to, people in China, things that happen in China, et cetera. And I think there's not enough of that coverage in the sort of media narratives in both countries about the other country. It's just kind of a drumbeat of negativity, and that's not a very accurate. It's not giving people a very accurate picture or impression. The problem, of course, is that not only do we have COVID-19 right now, which has prevented us from actually seeing each other for now over 2 years, only on screen, and very difficult to travel, particularly to China, but just difficult to travel at all, and difficult to have in-person events. Look at what's happened to ChinaFest, it's all online. So that's one thing, but the other problem is that the governments, you would think that people-to-people diplomacy, cultural exchange would be able to take place outside the lanes of government, but the two governments have actually done a lot in the last several years to impede these kinds of exchanges. And those kind of policies to impede people-to-people exchanges between the US and China are pretty much still on the books. They haven't been lifted. So we've pulled Peace Corps out of China under President Trump. We stopped the Fulbright program under President Trump. We put visa restrictions on under President Trump. None of this had anything to do with COVID-19. It was predated that. And there has been, I think, a pretty well publicized series of cases of judicial action against Chinese researchers, et cetera. So in an effort to try to ferret out, people who are stealing commercial secrets or something. So all of this has really put a damper on the prospects for people-to-people exchange. And I hope that there are, enough people out there who will do their own research and study, or have their own connection, or not be willing to imbibe the kind of popular rhetoric, and will try to find their own information about and reasons for engaging in people-to-people exchange, and insist on doing it, because I really think that this is kind of something that should be able to take place, as you say, outside of when government to government relations are fraught, and keep the relations going. I have to say, the business community has served a pretty important function in US-China relations historically, going back hundreds of years, actually, not just in the recent period. And that channel today is also not working very well. And although, the US business community is still super active in China, the trade is frankly up, in spite of, the difficult official relationship, which does go to show you the power of the sort of people-to-people things and what can happen even in spite of the government policies. But, and US businesses are still doing well in China, but there is this feeling that it's like not going to be going as well. And there's also official kind of discouragement about it. So people are quiet about it. You don't hear about it as much. And I think that's unfortunate. I mean, there's frustration on the part of the businesses. Why can they not, why are people not, hearing their concerns or listening to, what they see as their interests in this larger relationship? But it does seem to be that their interests are not at the front of the priority list right now.
Thank you so much.
I'll ask the next one then. I'm Stephen Long in the political science department, and I also teach in global studies here. My background is in international relations, and music to my ears to hear you talk about theories about power transitions and the Thucydides trap, of course. And And I wonder, one of the important things about that argument from Allison and others is that the thing that makes some transitions peaceful and others violent is thought to be the level of dissatisfaction that the rising power has with kind of the rules of the road as they were crafted before their rise. So when the US rose relative to Great Britain, the passing of the powers happened without incident, largely because the two agreed on important principles about international politics. So I guess you could say that it's not a question of when China will surpass the United States economically or militarily, but the crucial point is how can China continue to grow and yet remain satisfied with the system that it's growing into? And I wonder what you think the United States can do, maybe 2 or 3 things that you think the United States could learn to compromise on or change its stance on to accommodate China's growth and ambitions without giving up any core values that we hold as central to the American view of the world.
Okay, you get the prize for asking the hardest question. So first of all, on the IR, the theory and the Thucydides trap and the history. I mean, one of the things about, and Graham will say this when he talks about his book, we don't have a real example of this kind of Thucydidean dynamic since the end of World War II and the emergence of all of this network of global institutions and international organizations and sets of rules and conventions and treaties. And of course, China didn't take the seat of the government of China until 1971 in the UN. So it did inherit from the previous Chinese government, the Republic of China on Taiwan that was sitting in that seat, some of the conventions that China had acceded to. But since 1971, China has really basically acceded to the lion's share of the conventions and commitments in the international system, be it, some took a lot of pulling and hauling, others not so much, but non-proliferation conventions and treaties, China has joined most of the international conventions and been a big supporter of non-proliferation, the non-proliferation regime, other conventions, having to do with all kinds of different things in terms of environment. It sponsored the biodiversity COP this year, et cetera, et cetera. So China has really become, it is a permanent 5 member of the UN Security Council, wields a veto. It's gone from pretty much always abstaining on difficult votes to actually, participating in a more meaningful way, I think, with its P5 membership. Sometimes that doesn't always make the US happy, but for the most part, China has voted in the UN Security Council in support of US initiatives and goals, et cetera, has really been a huge, of course, supporter of the global economic institutions. And that's been a key part of China's development. So China, I think, does understand that the international system has really benefited China's development, to an incredible extent. And, this talk of China being a revisionist power in the international system, I think, is not capturing at all really accurately the dynamic, because certainly China does not seek to overturn a big parts of the international system. The part they have the problem with is the sort of the interventionist part of the international system, which has really come about pretty recently, I think. And they don't, they are a major protector of state sovereignty in the international system, which frankly the US also is. So we don't like to maybe admit that, but if we were looking at, if a person came down from another planet and looked at who the major most jealous protectors of state sovereignty are in the international system, China and the US and Russia would be at the top of anybody's list. So you know, and that is understandable since they're the biggest and most powerful states. But, you know, I think, will China be satisfied with the rules and adopt all of the rules that the US would want it to adopt and not have any differences with us? No. But does China care about a lot of the things that we would care about? Yes. They have a different way of going about satisfying those things. And I think that, you know, the tactics of how do we do this is where we have the most salient differences. And to me, as a former diplomat, that's a negotiation, and that's where you make compromises. So for example, China recently proposed to the UN Disarmament Committee a set of principles that would govern the use of autonomous weapons or artificial intelligence in from military uses, trying to limit that, because obviously we want, if people are going to use weapons, we want there to be a human decision-making element to the chain of events. And, you know, the US, I'm not sure what our response has been, but I would predict that our response would be negative because, you know, generally we have a different approach on how to do these things than the Chinese side does. But we probably agree that, you know, these kinds of things need to be regulated. So let's agree that these kinds of things should be regulated, that it's a concern for the future and that we should get ahead of it and put something in place, and then it's a negotiation. You know, technology is particularly fraught because nobody knows where it's going and nobody wants to wall off areas of future development. So that's another concern on something like AI. But in general, kind of limits on, you know, another area is limiting drone sales, you know, around the world, because this is another area of future. You know, it's an unregulated space and it's potentially very dangerous when these kinds of weapons can get into the hands of anybody. And it should be regulated by the international system. And China agrees with that and the US agrees with that. We just have to, but we're also sort of in conflict because our companies compete in the area of drone sales. So that's these things are always very complicated, but I believe that China, you know, that we can reach regimes that would serve to restrain the worst elements of things that are coming our way and restrain both countries, you know, to an extent that they won't like, but that they can live with. The big area that I think is a problem, and we haven't figured out, you know, how to deal with it yet, is the economy. And that is a problem because basically if China, which you know, basically asserted that it was on a path to development where it would allow market mechanisms to govern the bulk of its economy as it integrated itself into the global trading system. If they are moving away from that toward a system that does look so much different from the rest of the global trading world that it's not going to be able to be integrated in a way that's not going to swamp and overwhelm every other economy because of their subsidies and their manufacturing power and et cetera, the unfairness of the way their system works now, that is going to create huge reverberations. And, you know, I think these things could be negotiated, but right now we have layered on top of that this, you know, national security fear. That anything that is good for the Chinese economy is bad for US national security and vice versa. And we have to get rid of that, has to be eradicated if we are going to proceed in a way that has sort of China as integrated as a kind of big and powerful, but quasi-normal country that we can all peacefully coexist with. And I think that we have a long way to go on all of these things. I was in a dialogue with Chinese counterparts the other night when one of the American participants said, you know, Xi Jinping, when he met with Barack Obama in 2013 for their first summit meeting in person in Sunnylands, California, at that time said, you know, the US and China need to develop a new model for major countries to get along and relate to one another, new model of big power relations, to avoid the Thucydides trap, to avoid all of these historical problems that have shown up in the past. And, you know, this American colleague said, you know, he was right. I mean, the US, actually, Barack Obama at the time said, yeah, that's a good idea. But then over time, you know, the US got less enthusiastic about that and thought it was a trap. But really, that is where we are. We still need that. We've spent now at least, that was 2013. So we've gone almost 10 years without kind of coming up with a solution. What is the new model that we can work to put together, and how can we compromise and fit our needs in together and get a kind of a good enough solution for both of us to live with? We haven't started really tackling that yet. And I think both sides are at fault. And now we've fallen into this trap of each seeing the other as some kind of existential threat, which if that persists, we will have the crisis that I mentioned at the end of my remarks, I'm afraid.
Because a good number of our students at Richmond show interest not just in international affairs, but maybe in a career in foreign service, and you've had an impressive career in foreign service, and yet it's kind of difficult to know how to advise them now, because there's been so much made over the past couple of years of an emptying out of the State Department, a lot of senior people choosing to leave. And there was a study out of Georgetown last summer that they polled 20% of the foreign service officers and found that that large sample, that a third were considering leaving government service. So it sounds like a bit of a crisis, but what would you say to a young person now who has a great interest in international affairs and cares about how the US interacts with the rest of the world? Would you advise them to consider a career in foreign service? Are there things that you wish you had known when you got into the business that you would like to tell them?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I would absolutely recommend, even today, even after, you know, recent trials and tribulations in US foreign policy, we need the best and the brightest people in the United States to, you know, go into public service and to try to solve some of these problems. They aren't going to solve themselves. And, you know, there's, you know, a lot of different factors that I think make people go into the foreign service, and all of them, any one of them can lead to a really satisfying career and a really just life of, you know, complete satisfaction, complete kind of actualization or self-realization, and complete, you know, adventure, and having just, you know, a really full experience both in career and in just life. You know, I went into the foreign service because I loved languages, because I love to travel, I love adventure, and I love meeting people. That's why I did it. I wasn't super, I mean, I have to say, even after getting out of Johns Hopkins SAIS and having lived in a couple places around the world teaching and et cetera, I wasn't super, you know, kind of thinking that I was going to somehow change the world or become the Secretary of State. That wasn't why I did it. I did it because I knew that that's what I liked and was passionate about. And so I think if you go into the foreign service, you should be passionate about those things, but you can also just make such a difference in the world by being an American in the world and meeting people and talking about, what you believe in and what America is doing. I mean, it's such a wonderful, wonderful way to spend your life. And, there are aspects of it that people can talk about that might be difficult. The two leading ones are, what about my family life? Because, in military, families face this too. So that, is real. It works out, very well for some people, and for some people, if it doesn't work out well, they might have to leave. But it's the same for any career, I would say, on that front. But you have to like kind of living overseas and moving, not infrequently. But the second thing, which is probably a more kind of substantive consideration, is, how can I represent the US government if I don't always agree with their policies? And this was a big one, of course, for the Iraq War in particular in 2003 at the State Department. A lot of people quit over that decision, which they felt was really wrong and really inimical to US interests and wasn't going to work out well. And of course, they were right. What I would say to that issue is, yes, the US government doesn't always make the right calls, and not all of their policies are things that you're going to be able to agree with. But you can at least engage in a spirited debate about those policies and see and explain to people why, they're being undertaken, even if you don't agree with them, and even if those people don't agree with them. And I think that kind of communication is going to be absolutely necessary, and we need to have people that are talking to people out in the world about what the US is doing and why, and engaging it and getting the feedback when people out in the world say that's a really dumb idea, you shouldn't do that. Send that back to Washington and say, hey, you guys in Washington think that all the European capitals are fully on board for this containment of China policy, and you're wrong. They are not with us, and you should pay attention to this. I mean, that can make a big difference. So we need people to do that too. And we need people to be brave and, have a little bit of a streak of rebelliousness in the Foreign Service. So, you're not always just towing the line. You have to speak truth to power. And this globalized world is not going back into the bottle, no matter what, you might hear in various quarters in Congress and elsewhere in Washington. The planet is getting smaller, the world is getting smaller, and we're not going to escape it. So I really hope that, people will look at this as an opportunity. It's a fantastic, wonderful, fun time. You get to do all kinds of fun things. And, the State Department is in this transition that the US is undergoing about what its role is in the world. It's inevitably getting caught in the crossfire. I think diplomacy has really taken a hit in the United States over the last couple of decades. It's not even just a recent phenomenon. It's partly, the fact that compromise is seen as equivalent to appeasement in many quarters right now in US society, amplified by sort of media narratives, et cetera. But, this will come back around, I believe, because we're just not going to be able to solve the complicated problems of today's world without talking, negotiations, diplomacy, and compromise. And so, I would say for people that are in college right now or graduate school, you are in the prime sort of time to get in now, because by the time you get into positions, it'll be time to renew American diplomacy and America's role in the world. And so you could be part of that.
Thank you so much. We'll turn now to student questions. They've been rolling in on the Q&A feature of the webinar. And I'll just take them in order. I'm going to ask them without attribution, because some of them do not have student names. So we'll just treat them all equally, no attribution. But the first is, how would you advise young scholars interested in equitable global development and Chinese language and politics to pursue an impactful career field in either government or the private sector?
Well, of course, I can harken back to the answer I just gave, which is first and foremost, you should consider joining the Foreign Service, and everybody can take the Foreign Service exam. I believe it's given annually. It's like an SAT test, but you don't have to, I think you don't have to pay for it. You just go and sit for a half a day and take the written exam. It's a merit-based entrance system. So you start with that process, and then the process keeps going through oral exams, et cetera, et cetera. So I really, again, recommend the diplomatic service for any US citizens, or for non-citizens, your own diplomatic service, because we need good counterparts on the other side too. And I think there are so many things now that can be done that will make an impact. There's government, which is the kind of the top-down version of, pursuing a meaningful career in international relations. But there's so many areas to go and do bottom-up diplomacy. People-to-people ties, as Professor Dan Chung was saying earlier, is so important. There are a lot of groups and exchange groups, but also NGO groups. There's academia, there's business. And, business linkages, as I just said, the globalization isn't going backwards. I mean, people are talking about bringing all American manufacturing supply chains back to America. It's just not going to happen. It's not realistic. And it's actually physically probably impossible to do, given where our skill sets have moved to and our comparative advantages have moved to. So we will be dealing with counterparts in foreign countries, and US business could be so well served and be so much more agile, resilient, competitive, effective if it had, people who were working in those businesses who could help to really cement the kinds of ties that businesses need to be making with businesses in other countries. Businesses these days are partnering, and they're also competing with the same companies, and that needs to be happening. I mean, that is the way that we're going to be going forward, especially in this increasingly technology intensive business world that we're living in. So I think, any of those fields would be areas that would make good use of these kinds of talents. When I graduated from college with a Russian major, there was really nowhere for me to go. Except maybe the State Department or the CIA. And, once I got out of graduate school in 1991 with the Russian degree, there were a lot more places for me to go because everyone was going to Russia to open up businesses, et cetera. And that trend is just going to continue in that direction, I would say.
Thank you. We have another question. This is, what are your thoughts on how the Biden administration engages Taiwan and how that will affect US-China relations?
Well, to start off on any question on Taiwan, I always say the most successful part of the US engagement strategy with China over the last 40 years has been Taiwan and its development, its incredibly vibrant society, its development as a democracy, and its development as an incredibly important economic node in the global economy. So, the fact that the US and China have been able to normalize diplomatic relations and manage the Taiwan issue to the point where Taiwan is such a roaring success story today, it is really testimony to the success. If we only had that as the success of the engagement strategy, that would already be a pretty remarkable achievement. So, anything that's done now that reverses, diminishes, or undermines that achievement, I would say is deserving of scrutiny and probably very unwise. And you would have to look pretty hard at what was the benefit of such a policy as against the potential cost with respect to the incredible success that this has seen. I mean, China, of course, sees Taiwan as part of its territory, handed back after World War II, and as a legacy of the sort of Chinese Civil War, where the former government fled to the island, and Mao Zedong decided, at that point, because of the Korean War and some other things, not to pursue it, but never acknowledged that Taiwan was not an integral part of China. This is a very sort of unique historical question, I would say, because the government on Taiwan also said that it was part of China, but from a different perspective. Now what we have is politics on Taiwan as a vibrant democracy having developed to the point where that perspective that has conveniently allowed us to paper over the ambiguity about Taiwan's status is changing, and it's becoming more difficult to manage in an era of kind of social media and a lot of kind of varying opinions given by people with varying degrees of understanding of the issue, given to sort of hyperbole and emotion. But, there's nobody, I don't think, in the world that could make a convincing case that somehow altering the status of the issue of Taiwan from what it is right now is going to be beneficial and worth the potential costs of such a move to the people on Taiwan. So what I counsel the Biden administration on with respect to Taiwan is don't rock the boat and don't try to make significant changes that risk sort of major losses, which I think is a real risk.
Thank you. I know you were worried about your grade earlier, but you're doing great. You keep this up. It's looking good for you at the end of the year.
Good.
Our next question is, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the Belt and Road Initiative and how it affects Chinese and US relations with Africa and other parts of the world.
Oh, another great question. So the Belt and Road Initiative is such an interesting evolution in Chinese, global economic statecraft and policy. I lived in Western China in the 2000s, and at that time, the big policy initiative from the Chinese central government was the Develop the West initiative. So this is kind of, as I've been watching the Chinese evolution in this area, it seems like the Develop the West policy went further west, and it was the New Silk Road, and now it's gone even sort of further, which is the Belt and Road Initiative, which combines the sort of New Silk Road, which was the land extension of Develop the West, with this kind of maritime development. But what it's really developed into is sort of China's external bilateral development assistance program on commercial terms. So, and this is something that, the Chinese have seen an opportunity that was left open by the development of, kind of the need for infrastructure in the developing world. China has a particular view on this because of the perspective that their development was jump-started and served by their capital investments in infrastructure in China. So they feel they have some know-how in this area and that they could be helpful to the developing world, but it's a lot more complicated than that. Of course, there are market opening considerations, there are connectivity considerations, and transport and export route considerations for China. There are resource implications. In other words, China wants to expand its infrastructure into Central Asia in order to get hydrocarbon and energy resources that it needs to power its own economic development. So it's a very complicated and not uniform, sprawling set of kind of projects that go around the world, including in sort of health capacity building and traditional kinds of things we would think of as development assistance, but also putting in kind of telecommunications backbone infrastructure and software and all kinds of other things, and building bridges and roads and railroads and power plants and ports, et cetera. You know, the US and Western countries have been conflicted, I think, over this whole area of China's economic statecraft for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons is we suspect that maybe some of this infrastructure development has to do with Chinese military expansion. I think that's a very small part of the concern, actually, and there hasn't been a lot of evidence to show that that is a major driver of what China is doing. But a more, I think, actual concern is that China is using this kind of bilateral program to go around sort of tried and true and long developed kind of international standards for infrastructure projects that have been developed by like the World Bank and other other development banks. And so was kind of relearning the lessons of some of the early failures of the developed world in doing these kinds of development projects, including, lax environmental standards, displacing local populations and not working with them, not employing local people, so displacing labor and things like that, which, I think were valid concerns at the beginning of the Belt and Road Initiative. Also, the fact that China was making these projects on commercial loan terms, which was adding mountains to some of these countries' debt burdens, and it wasn't clear how China expected these were going to be paid, but and whether these projects were economically sustainable. I mean, actually could earn money for these countries, or whether they were just kind of white elephants. So those were all, I think, concerns. Some of them were valid, not all of them are valid. But the bigger issue here is, why is China developing this kind of outside the international system, very huge kind of economic development project that's not really got a lot of oversight or accountability? And, part of the explanation for why they had to do that is because the Western countries didn't really, let China play with the others in the World Bank and other kinds of development infrastructures. I mean, the Chinese launched their own development bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the US and Japan refused, to join and tried to get other countries to not join. And that was a bank where actually the Chinese were trying to implement international standards. So I think we have a lot of concerns in the West and on the part of OECD and developed countries about what China's doing. But China's, in a way, the response has something to do with the fact that the Western developed countries wouldn't allow China to meet these needs that were so obvious on the part of developing countries. And I think there's a lot of water now under the bridge, and I don't know if we could come together and try to have a more kind of consolidated approach to all of these issues in the developing world on infrastructure development. But it makes sense to me that we ought to, the World Bank approach to development projects is also proven, I think, to be unworkable because it's now so mired in regulation and application and feasibility studies that things never get done. And that was a frustration in the developing world. So there was a need that wasn't being filled. China goes in to fill it, gets criticized. The question is, where do we go from here? And I think, there needs to be an overhaul, frankly, of the Bretton Woods institutions and the whole development infrastructure. The UN has a big push, and China has now made its own push on the Global Development Initiative. The UN has its sustainable development goals, and this should be something that upper income and middle income countries that have something to contribute, like China, should come together and kind of work on these standards and have a common approach, a coordinated approach at least, and not be kind of competing or bad mouthing or bashing or making it more difficult for these countries to proceed with their own development projects.
I think that will have to conclude our student questions. Thank you so much on behalf of the university and the university community. I know our students have benefited tremendously by having a chance to listen to you and hear your perspectives. And I'm sure that I speak for Dr. Chen as well when I say that we also enjoyed that very much. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Rose.
Susan, wow. What a very inspiring talk and a very honest discussion. I feel we can continue the conversation, perhaps sometimes in the future at the University of Richmond, and also perhaps here where I am in DC. Chinese has a saying, 10年种树, 百年树人. It takes 10 years to cultivate a tree, and it would take 100 years to cultivate a people. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. I also like to take this opportunity to thank you, Stephen and Dan, for your participation and a very lively discussion. Special thanks to Michael, Diana, and AP for your excellent technical support, and to you, our audience, for joining us. Wishing everyone a very blessed year of the water tiger.
Thank you.